God or God's people. Instead, we are defined by Christ's life and work on our behalf. We kneel, we confess and repent, and then what a wonder, the word of absolution. Almighty God, have mercy on you. Forgive all of your sins through our Lord Jesus Christ. Strengthen you in all goodness, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, keep you in eternal life. And she goes on, when we confess and receive absolution together, we are reminded that none of our pathologies, neuroses, or sins, no matter how small or secret, affect only us. We are a church, a community, a family. We are not simply individuals with our pet sins and private brokenness. If we are saved together as the body of Christ, as a church. And because of this, I need to hear my forgiveness proclaimed and to have it remind me that though my sin is worse than I care to admit, I am still welcome here. I am still called into this community and loved. And I want to submit that when we have been deeply immersed in the currents of our digital ecology, this environment that is shaped and formed by our digital devices and obligations. And those currents have a certain story, right? This social imaginary. When we encounter this kind of story, this account of confession and the church, it is arguably to come up against something that is positively alien, right? Warren's description brings into sharp relief the vast distance between the posture we practice when we are steeped in the social imaginary of the digital ecology and the posture that Christian spirituality encourages, right? So when we are online, the normalized digital practices are of keeping up, grasping for attention, seeking the rewards of affirmation, right? And all of that, actually, it looks pretty thin and paltry against the sheer magnificence of what is promised here in the ritual of confession and absolution, right? To be invited to freely admit our failure and discover that we're still loved and welcomed, right? This is impossible, right, for us to imagine. Incredibly impossible to imagine on social media, right? Like how does that even work, right? And so I think what is very interesting in this particular moment for followers of Christ is that we may profess many things in our faith, but most of us are desperately trying to keep up with the demands of our digitally saturated lives. And they're different things, right? We profess to believe something, but we're living something else out. And we just kind of lose track, right? Like we don't mean to, we just kind of get lost. Like we don't know who we are, we don't know what we're doing, right? We're just kind of like, I just have to keep up. And so we lose track of the fact that the Christian tradition produces a story, a social imaginary that understands our embodiment, our worth, our relationship with each other, with time and place, in terms that are often completely opposite from the story we are trained into when we are enmeshed in our digital ecology. And so, again, we end up living these lives that express a story that doesn't quite match up with the theological and faith commitments that we profess to be true. And so what I want to do today is first talk more about this social imaginary of the digital that we are being trained into, consider why it is that we feel compelled to live into that story, and then explore how viewing digital practice as a form of liturgy can help us begin to reimagine our soul formation. So the first thing, what is the story we are being trained into? Okay, so one of the key features of this social imaginary is the normalized expectation of what media scholars call permanent connectivity. And when you look at the history of technologies that is related to mass communication, right, you see that the promise of connection has always been there from the start. Right? You look at the telegraph, you look at the radio, you look at television. Certainly with the internet, it's always been about networking. So there's always been this desire to connect and to share. But we all know that being connected in 2024 is really different from what it meant back in the early days of the internet, when you had this big, boxy desktop, and you had to plug yourself into the wall, and you had to dial that terrible number, and that screeching sound went on for too long, right? And so many of us just sat through that, right? That was what it looked like to be connected. You're at home, you're at the office, right? And so I wanna suggest that being connected today is not an activity, right? It's not something we do. It's not a behavior. It's not getting connected, like dialing up a phone, right? A phone call. Rather, being connected today is actually closer to a state of consciousness, right? It's a human condition. It's not in the realm of action or behavior. It's just what we are, right? It is a state of being. We are all just permanently connected, whether you're actually on your device or not. And so I want to unpack this idea of permanent connectivity in 3 ways. So first, we can all understand how permanent connectivity works when our technology is mobile, right? When you can start carrying it around with you, it's on your wrist, it's in your pockets, it seems to be living and breathing alongside us wherever we go. A study a couple years ago showed that 30% of Americans say that they are almost constantly online. And you look up there at the stat and you see that percentage goes up for the younger set, right? 10 years ago, there was a study that found in families that over 2/3 of parents and almost 80% of teens were checking their devices at least hourly. And that was over 10 years ago. So you can imagine post-pandemic, right, how that percentage is way up. And so certainly, right, the fact that our technology has changed and that you're not tied to the wall, right, makes it much more easy to be permanently connected. But what I think makes permanent connectivity compelling is the fact that our technology is social. And I don't mean social in the way that we talk about social. I don't mean like, oh, it helps me make friends and talk to people. I mean social in a sociological way, which gets at the way that our technology is actually embedded in the structures of our lives now. It is embedded in institutional life. It is embedded in the responsibilities we feel within our families, in our churches, in our schools, in our work. And so what ends up happening is, even though it is often wonderful to be able to use technology to keep up with friends and family, maybe it's wonderful to keep up with school and work with technology. I'm sure we would all beg to differ. But the point here is that, yes, it's more efficient and so forth. There are benefits. But what I'm interested in is in the fact that all the social obligations and expectations that characterize these various areas of our life often translate into being always available and immediately responsive to any text or email, right? So we come to feel that we have to be on our devices in order to be a good student, a good leader, a good parent, a good friend, a good colleague, right? Like, we all want to be these things, and there's nothing wrong with that. What's interesting and different is that the technology has become embedded in how to do those things, right? And so that's why we can't stop, right? Because we want to be responsible and we want to perform well. I mean, not just perform, but be well, right, in those various roles. And then finally, layer on the fact that our current digital media services deliver content that is infinitely novel. That means that there's always a new video, there's always a new post, there's always a new email, right? There's always something to read or watch. And so when you mix mobile and social and infinitely novel together, what you get is what we live. It is a psychological cocktail of pleasure, anxiety, felt expectations, right? And so even when our devices aren't on our bodies, even if we don't see them, our consciousness has become trained and immersed in these habits of being formed by an unceasing awareness of how life is constantly, as Dalton Conley describes it, being lived elsewhere, right? Being permanently connected means our bodies are in one place, our minds and consciousness are somewhere else. They're on the stuff of the screen. Usually we think it's probably more important than wherever we happen to be, and so that's why we have to peek, right? I gotta peek, I gotta find out what's happening, right? So one thing that trains us in this state of consciousness is certainly the sheer amount of time we spend looking at our screens, right? You do something enough times, right? It trains us. And just a couple more stats to help us think through this. In 2019, the average American child, 8 to 12, was engaged in about 5 hours a day of non-school related screen time. And then it goes up to 7.5 hours for teenagers, which is almost half of their waking hours. Unless we get carried away by thinking, oh, those young people, right? Parents and older generations, we are not off the hook by any stretch of the imagination. The data's come in. Parents and older generations very often are just as bad, if not worse. Before the pandemic, there was a study done in 2020 that showed that over 50% of parents admit to being on social media too much. And I like this one. Over 2/3 of them report at least being distracted by their phones sometimes when spending time with their kids, right? So we're all in this together, right? We're all needing to sort this out. And while we can all kind of sit in horror over how many hours we may be online, I think what is actually more interesting is the fact that we don't really even realize that we're spending that much time online, right? It's not like we're just sitting down and just like jamming out 7.5 hours online, right? It's not like we're like gaming for 7.5 hours. Well, I don't know, some of you might be, right? Right, but those hours accumulate, right? They're these accumulations of micro moments throughout the day that we don't even realize we're doing, right? It's like in between activities, right before that meeting, waiting in line, we're waiting for the hot water to come on, let's check something, right? So the digital practices that characterize our lives are largely habitual, they're automatic, we're not thinking about it, right? It is not a behavior, activity that we're like, oh, I am going to do this, right? It's just woven into how we live and breathe now. And so what is going on with us, right? Like, how do we get here? Why are we so deeply immersed in these rhythms that maybe for some of us, we recognize it's veering on addictive. Maybe for others of us, we might say, I know I'm not living my best life, but I don't know what else to do. So here I want to suggest and turn to some older thinkers, pre-internet thinkers, that might lend us some insight. In 1958, Hannah Arendt wrote a book, The Human Condition, where she notes that a reporter characterized the first successful satellite launch, okay, as the first, quote, step towards escape from men's imprisonment to the earth. And Arendt saw this milestone as perhaps one in a long line of technologies driven by a wish to escape the human condition. I think this observation's super interesting because it makes me wonder, maybe that's partly why we are so compelled to be permanently connected, because we too want to we wish to escape the human condition, right? Maybe this is why some of us are stuck to always wanting to read the news, right? Because the news online gives us some kind of comfort of knowledge. Maybe we want to calm our fears, right? Or maybe this is why some of us run to social media, or we stream entertainment, or some of us engage in way too much online retail, right? Because we're trying to reduce the distance we feel between ourselves and others. And we're looking for solutions to these age-old problems of loneliness, of alienation, right? That philosophers, artists, theologians have pondered through the ages. And maybe it is why, right? We run to the beckoning arms of our digital technologies, and when we look even further past 1958 and we go, let's go a couple hundred years, even earlier, we find Pascal writing this. He said, "Being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, we have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things." I don't know about you, but there's something strangely comforting about the fact that even Pascal, right, observed our instinct to run away from the helplessness of being human, right? We're not the only ones, right, who have had to struggle against the problems of misery and brutality and struggle poorly, right? But I think what is different for us today compared to Pascal, right, 400 years ago, Hannah Arendt, 1958, what's different about today is that our digital world is disturbingly effective at helping us not to think about such things, right? Pascal didn't have streaming entertainment to just kind of binge watch whatever, right, after a really hard day, right? Instead, we live in this realm that often offers up what Jean Baudrillard termed the hyper-real, right? What we get in the digital is this kind of enhanced version of reality, right? It's more beautiful than what actual reality is. It's more glamorous, it's alluring, right? And if any of you know anything about the digital industry, right, they are pouring money into getting experts in behavioral psychology, brain science, the experts who design casinos and addictive industries, right? They're all coming in to consult, finally calibrate these algorithms to calculate the optimal way to keep us on these sites, these platforms, right? These digital industries are very intentional about wanting to colonize our attention, finding new ways to monetize our loneliness, our desire for relationship and belonging. And so many of these experts understand us so well, right? We've given over a lot of data, they know our personal interests, but broadly speaking, they know as human beings we're pretty basic. There are three things that we like. We like things that are funny, we like things that are sexy, we like things that are violent. And they know that when we're tired, we have no willpower. And that video, after that episode's done, 2.5 seconds, if you don't click stop or pause, that next episode is coming and you're just like, I'll just watch another one, right? They know this. And so the point is this, right? Unlike Arendt and Pascal, we are up against a vast system of persuasion that is working to get us to stay distracted, to stay in this other space, right, away from the actual reality. And it is no wonder, right, that we feel compelled to turn to our screens whenever being human is just too much to bear. And as a counterpoint, well, before I get to the counterpoint, I think I want to suggest that, you know, we spend a lot of time in our culture saying that we're online because we're trying to keep up. We talk a lot about FOMO, right? We're afraid of missing out. But I actually want to suggest something slightly different and say, I think we're actually online a lot because we're actually a people who are living on the run. Like, we are running away from the pain of being human, right? There's just so much of being human that is very hard. As a young person, as an older person, right? There's just a lot of difficult things. And sometimes it's just easier. Just try to go over there and deal with it, right? Be distracted or try to exert some kind of control in this digital space. And as a counterpoint, I want to suggest that the Christian story is not what a lot of people might presume. It is not a story of escape. It is not a story of, okay, we can escape to heaven if we do enough good works or sacrifice. It's actually this story that promises the presence of God, right, who will be with us no matter what, and is going to go through no matter what with us, right? And we find this in the incarnation of Jesus, right? We see how the God of the universe consents to experiencing the fullness of the human condition, right? He's poor, he experiences political oppression, ethnic marginalization, injustice, right? He allows himself to be subjected to the worst of human suffering, and doesn't choose to withdraw his hand, but undid its power by overcoming it through the resurrection, right? This is the heart of the Christian story. The steadfast promise that God's presence is with us. And that's what gives us hope. That's what empowers us to go through all that being human can mean. And yet, many of us would count ourselves as one of the Americans who are almost constantly online and with all of the urges to perform and to hide our weaknesses and to compete against each other for attention. And as we are like the first century disciples, right, where we're trying to figure it out, and we understand that Jesus has called us to abide in him as he promises to abide in us. But as modern day followers of Christ, I think to the extent that we are training our consciousness with these habits, what's actually happening to us is that we are not so much abiding in Jesus, but we are abiding in the digital. And we are finding that the digital is actually abiding in us. And I know this is a rather bleak conclusion to have reached. Maybe some of us might say that this compulsive checking of our devices is an impoverished form of abiding. But I want to suggest that maybe we actually have something to learn from the ways that we abide in the digital. Because I think we can recognize how deeply we have cultivated a heart of expectancy towards all things digital. And if we can recognize this, then we might be able to pursue a life where we use those same muscles and direct them towards the divine rather than the digital. So let me unpack this a bit. So when we live in this normalized compulsive use of our digital platforms and apps and devices, right, we spend our lives in a state of waiting, anticipating, right, sensing that there's always something maybe asking for my attention, or that there's a word from someone or anyone, in fact, right? Don't you find yourself some days you're just like looking at your screen and you're like, I already know all these people said these things to me. Like, doesn't someone else have something else to say to me? Come on now, right? Like, give me something new, right? We're looking, we're waiting for something. And we go through our days kind of accustomed to this sort of anticipation, right? Maybe there's something interesting, fun, right, meaningful. And we're kind of like, I don't know, do any of you watch or read those Jane Austen novels, right? We're kind of like those disadvantaged maidens, right, that were kind of sitting around waiting, right? They were waiting in the parlor for these suitors to come and, save them from their situation. We're just like those maidens, right? We're kind of sitting in the parlor, always waiting. Like, is someone going to come, right? And so the notification pings on our device, and it's like we hear these digital footsteps approaching. And rather than those Jane Austen maidens who have been trained in Victorian codes of refined decorum, right, who just kind of sit there, right? We're not like that at all, right? Our desperation is unbridled, right? We just like pick up our devices and we just like reflexively leap and devour whoever's going to come through the door, right? We're just like anything, anyone, just come, right? We're just always waiting, hungry, right? And I'm painting this picture because I think what it shows is that we have actually demonstrated to ourselves that we have remarkable endurance and capacity to remain in tune to something, to our devices. It's the first thing we greet in the morning. It's the last thing we take to us when we go to bed. In between meetings, any pause, we are very diligent at tending to our devices. It's always on our minds, it's always in our hearts, maybe not central, but it's always there, right? Why? I want to argue because we are waiting. We are searching for joy, we are searching for satisfaction, we are looking for purpose, we are looking for love. And so we wait. And that's why we abide in the digital. So, what if we were to take this heart of expectancy and shift it and say, I'm going to cultivate a heart of expectancy for God's desire to speak to me, to commune with me, right? What if we were to grow in our habits and routines to stretch out our antenna towards checking in with God as much as I am always checking in with my smartphone or platforms, right? What if the church was an institution that equipped people to grow in this countervailing orientation that directed our hearts of expectations towards God as the source of joy and satisfaction and purpose and love, rather than our screens? Right? I ask these rhetorical questions, right, wholly recognizing that we live in times many of us aren't going to be able to pitch our devices. We can't throw out our email. We can't get off of this platform, right? I understand it can be extremely costly to even consider those things, right? So we do need these practical ways to figure out, well, how do I live with this stuff then, right? How do I live in a way that starts me down this road of retraining my heart of expectancy? And so one of the paradigms I've found helpful is this idea of viewing digital practice as a form of liturgy. Now, I understand that the scholars have read Jamie Smith's You Are What You Love, and so I'm drawing deeply from his work here. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, Smith builds on this Augustinian understanding of Christian formation and bodily practice. And he says that, a lot of times we think of human beings mainly as thinkers, right? Like we get knowledge and certain beliefs in our head, and then there's like a trickle down. It just like impacts the rest of our lives. But he says, that might be true, right? He's a philosopher after all. But he says, but we might actually benefit from better appreciating how we are primarily desiring creatures, right? We are driven not by these beliefs and information or knowledge, but we're driven by our appetites, right? What we do with our bodies, our loves, the stuff in our guts, more than the stuff in our brains. And so the idea here is that if we can recognize how we are desiring creatures, formed by the visceral and the bodily, we can re-see how our seemingly mundane routines function to train us towards some kind of goal, some end, some telos, some vision of the good life. And so in all of our digital practices of checking our emails, messages, reading social media, when we first wake up, right before we go to bed, in between meetings, right? All of our desires and soul formation is happening. All of that is seemingly mundane, but it's actually forming us. It's stuff we're doing with our bodies. It is training us towards becoming some sort of person. And so when we unreflectively adopt the taken for granted norms in our society, we will find ourselves engaged in what Smith calls secular liturgies, right? These cultural habits that we practice routinely with our bodies. And the effect is that it misforms our desires. It misforms our loves. So he writes this: secular liturgies capture our hearts by capturing our imaginations and draw us into ritual practices that teach us to love something very different from the kingdom of God. And so to awaken ourselves to how our bodily practices signal and shape our loves and who we're becoming, we can ask questions of ourselves like this: where in my daily life are there these secular liturgies that are putting obstacles between me and perceiving God's presence, hearing God speak, right? How do perhaps my digital secular liturgies train me to devalue the people that are around me, the places that I am in? Maybe I have missed an opportunity to encounter the Christ in the quiet of my own spirit or in the person that I didn't expect to be here. And Smith goes on and he says, part of our job is to identify these secular liturgies, but then he recommends that we need to develop what he calls counter liturgies. These are these routines and habits that push back against the misformations of the heart. And I really love this because I think so much of our digital conversations are about just like getting rid of the bad stuff, like go on digital detox, get off of social media, right? Do less time, right? And I think all of that is worthy and good. But Smith's point is it's not enough to just remove the bad, so to speak. You gotta fill it with the good. You need the stuff that is life generative. Why? The Augustinian answer is this: because our hearts are restless and will remain so until we find our rest in God. We are just, frankly, desiring creatures. We have appetites. You can diet, but you're gonna have to eat something, right? So you might as well figure out what you're gonna eat that's gonna fill you with the right kind of energy that's gonna give you health in the long run, right? So in response to our digital secular liturgies, we can ask, okay, so how can I push back, right? So if I gotta spend all this time online, how do I set myself up to open myself to these new opportunities of experiencing a different kind of living, right? How can I redirect my loves back to experiencing communion with God and others in my life? So I think an obvious place, and I think during Lent we can appreciate this, there's a whole Christian heritage of spiritual disciplines that maybe some of us are familiar with, right? The disciplines of silence, solitude, fasting, prayer, lectio divina, right? All of these have been around for a long time. The Desert Fathers, right, have shown us so many of the goods that come out of it. But we could draw on them as counter liturgies to kind of push back against the subtle but real misformations of our digital secular liturgies. Another approach that I'd like to suggest, because I think some of us might hear like spiritual disciplines, we're like, that's like for really holy people, I'm not that advanced, let's do something else, right? So I like to suggest that maybe we think about taking up what I call experiments. And what I mean by that is it's maybe we try creating circumstances that encourage us to kind of step out of our comfort zone a little, develop a taste for something different, something new, that might actually become a precious source of life and vitality. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of experiments, okay? And I am like one of those mad scientists that always experiments on herself before she recommends them to others. So I'm still standing here. I'm mainly normal and okay. So I don't think any harm will come. So the first one is about monotasking. So the idea is this, right? So if we live in a world where we have secular liturgies that train us to always be multitasking with our digital devices, what counter liturgy can we go to? We can try an experiment of monotasking. And it is what it sounds like. When you're doing that thing, you only do that thing. 1. So, a very obvious place to start, but challenging, is if you find yourself eating by yourself. If you're with someone, you should talk to them, okay? But if you just are eating your morning cereal or, your sandwich at work, try just eating. No scrolling, no listening to a podcast, no, right? Just eating. When you're driving, again, only when you're alone, when you're driving, what would it be like to just drive? No music, no telephone calls, right? And for those of you who are feeling very ambitious, I have a high-level experiment for you. When you are waiting online, not online, but at the grocery line for the super elite in airports, that's very advanced, so don't just jump there, okay? Start with the grocery line first. When you're waiting, what would it be like to just wait? These are experiments. They are not forms of self-improvement. There is no virtue in being like, I have become a supreme waiter, right? Like, it's not that, right? The point of experiments is to gather data, find out something about yourself. Maybe you fail miserably. I started driving and only driving. I only had a 10-minute commute from my kids' school home. The first time I did it, I was like breaking out in a cold sweat. I was like, this is horrible, because I was so used to listening to something, right? I was like, this is so quiet, I'm getting nervous, right? I don't know what to do with myself. But I kept leaning into it, and what was fascinating was as I leaned into it, I started seeing my neighborhood as if for the first time. I was like, oh, look, the neighbors put up new shrubs. Oh, they have a new dog, right? Or I started actually realizing what was in my mind and in my spirit. And then as I kept on pressing in, I started realizing that was the only 10 minutes of my day that was quiet. Nobody could reach me. Nobody could ask me for anything, right? It was beautiful. 10 minutes. And so the idea with monotasking is exploring what's happening in my brain. Do I become more aware of who's around me or where I am? Do I become more aware of God's presence, right? So monotasking, really fun. Another way you can try to experiment is to push back against the tendencies of having our digital permeate all places and all times of our lives, right? And we can think about how we might experiment with protecting sacred spaces or sacred times, right? So there might be a place that we can say, this is just going to be a tech-free place, right? The dining table, this room. I tell my students at my college, mischievously, it's true though, I say, there is a tree on this campus that is my sacred place. Tech-free, I go there when I need to just decompress. I'm not going to tell you where my tree is because I don't want you to find me, right? So they're always like, where's Dr. Song, right? But I have this sacred place, right, that is my place that I go to when I need to be quiet and I need to process life. Some of us might have certain times of the day right? Maybe it is when you first wake up, those first 15 minutes. Maybe it is when you go to bed, right? That we just say, hey, it's just going to be tech-free. I'm actually going to smell the coffee. I'm actually going to listen to the rain. I'm actually going to look into the eyes of the person I share this house with, right? And I'm not going to worry about the emails and all that stuff. Just 15 minutes, right? So experiencing, again, what is possible if we set up these small little boundaries. And again, maybe we struggle, right? Maybe we fail, so to speak, to carry these out. But again, with experiments, the point is to be curious, right? To say, hey, what's going on? Like, why is it so hard for me? Like, I set up this desk and my devices still get here. Like, I don't know what's going on, right? And so it's okay, right? It's a place of curiosity that we might even bring into our prayer lives and say, Lord, it's so simple. I can't do this. What do I need to be paying attention to? What please show me, right? Like, how can I move out of this rut that I seem to be in? So we make it a part of our journey with the Lord. So to close, I want to end with thinking about this word liturgy. I love this word. In the Greek, it means the work of the people. And it has this way of bringing out how certain practices are not actually individual in nature, but is the product of the people, right? Of many people, a community or a culture. And when we think about social media and so many of our digital practices, right, they exercise power on us precisely because they are practiced as a people, right? So many of us would not be on whatever platform of choice you are on if our friends weren't there or if the important people in our lives weren't there, right? And so if secular liturgies are practices that possess power because we engage in them together, then I think the church needs to find ways to engage in bodily counter-liturgies together, right? Like, we can all do stuff individually, and I think that's great. But I think to make things sustainable and actually effective is we need to do things as groups, as a people, right? To discover what's actually possible in these counter-liturgies. And that's where I believe the church really can dig into the truths of our theology and spirituality. And I think we really do have the resources of really good news to our society that is increasingly tired, right? We are digitally exhausted as a society. And as the church, we can offer something that is countervailing in a very hopeful way. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Speaking of technology, not strong with it, but we're going to do some Q&A. Dr. Song, do you mind answering some questions?
Yeah, sure.
That'd be great. I've got a few mic runners. If you've been here before, I've got two of our scholars. We have Nathan, we have Nick in the back. So if you could just raise your hand, stand up, and they'll come to you and hand you the mic to ask a question.
And just so you know, the QR code that I just put up is just for those of you who are like me. Whenever I go to talks, I never have questions right after the talk because I am a slow processor. I always get home, and then 2 hours later, I'm like, hey, I have a question. And so that's there for those of you who are like me. I'd love to hear your questions. That just sends your questions straight to my email. And so that's just a place, if you want to ask questions or if you want to just give me general feedback, that's the place to go.
So one of the things that came to mind while you were talking about sort of the insistence of technology, and I think one of the reasons that it's so powerful and does form us is because in this day and age, we all have one that we carry around in our pocket. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, because there is something buzzing and forming me right there on my leg right now, what is the sort of spiritual counterforming thing that I carry around or should carry around in your view?
I'm sorry. Do you want me to use a mic? Oh, okay. What is the spiritual counter liturgy to that buzzing? Oh boy. Well, one, I would say let's shut off those notifications. Those are um, those are highly problematic for any of our sanity. I think it is a kind. I mean, it is what I was talking about cultivating a heart of expectancy. It is really developing a capacity, kind of so this isn't a practice, but it is starting to become intentional about, say, believing that God is going to show up at any moment. Right? I'm walking down this road. I don't know. God might show up in this person. God might show up in this flower that's growing out of the crack because I just need a word of encouragement because I'm having a rough day, right? It is you might argue the ubiquitous presence of God, right? That we can, again, the contemplative tradition, I think, right, teaches us that we can train to become more in tune, right? To perceive the presence of God, not just in kind of the thunderbolt from heaven way, but usually in hidden ways. And so I think it requires slowing down very often and not just being like, I'm from the East Coast. I grew up outside of New York City. I am all about this, right? I mean, that's just what living is about in that area. And so it is needing to realize, no, like, God didn't call me to just this, right? God calls me to be present wherever I am. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask, in general, I feel like I've kind of picked up a sense of, as like Kay Smith would say, this appetite for what you're talking about, this kind of to disconnect and not be so reliant on technology and the screens. Yeah. But I'll give this example of a few months ago, I was looking into applying for jobs, and so I got in my car and drove around to a couple of different stores and went in to ask for applications, and it was all directed online.
Yeah.
All of them have online applications,
Yes.
but everyone I talked to seemed to have some sort of appreciation for the fact that I was there in person. And so there's an appetite for the physical connection, but it almost seems that technology has too much to offer to really make a change towards that. So I guess my question is, like, what would you recommend to people with that appetite, how to move forward with that while also living in a world where technology has a lot to offer, whether that's a mindset shift or like a physical shift? Yeah,
no, that's good. So I'm not on social media. I used to be. I'm old enough where Facebook was the place to be. And I got off of Facebook, and I'm a sociologist. I write on technology. This is bad for my career, right? Like, I should be on social media, right? Like, you publish a book, and what do publishers ask you? What is your social media presence? I do a podcast interview. They ask me, so what's your handle? Like, where can people find you? Right? This is very bad for me, occupationally, right? But for me, I'm like you. Like, I have an appetite for not being, right, tethered. And for me personally, being on social media was destructive in particular ways, right? I found myself just, I couldn't stop thinking about it, right? And so that's why I walked away from it, because I was like, this is no way to live. I don't know what's happening to me. But I had to, one, knowing the career I'm pursuing, I needed to, one, acknowledge that decision will likely create costs, like real costs, right? So maybe a publisher is going to be like, nope, no thank you. Like, I need someone who's writing and who has 3,000 followers. We're not going to publish with you, right? Like, just game over, right? I mean, there are presses that are like that. So I have to be willing to be okay with that, right? So my point is, there are real costs. Like, so maybe you won't get that job, right? Or that kind of job. And you have to figure out, is that worth it? Is that going to be okay with me? Does that make sense for whatever life God is calling me to live? But I think there are then also other ways around it, right? So like, I love the fact that you went in person, right? And you might actually stand out in the crowd now because they'll be like, hey, yeah, that guy actually came here, right? I don't remember that person, right? Or people still say like the handwritten note, like strangely still gets attention, even though it seems really old-fashioned, right? But it's like everyone is on the digital, that if you show up with a handwritten note, people actually, like you actually stand out, right? So my point is, you can find strategies to try to compensate, right, for the thing that you know you are missing, right? So if you choose not to do certain things digitally, you have to acknowledge what the cost is and then figure out, okay, but if I still want to do this thing, what am I going to do that's going to set me apart to still get into this space, right? And so for me, what that looks like is working really hard at networking, knowing lots of different groups of people, like actually, so that when I'm going to a publisher or press, I can say, I don't have 3,000 followers, but I have connections with this list of institutions, this group of people, right? Like, I have put in time to cultivate those relationships, right, in my regular life. And so I'm trying to make up for it, you know? So I think I'm trying to answer your question in the most practical way because I recognize it as a real thing, right? And a real thing to figure out. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm.
Hi. Hey. So this could probably be a lecture in itself, but as the parents of 3 young children, you know, we're always curious of how can we establish healthy habits for our kids, because at some point they will need a phone. And so what are some things that you have done or encouraged to do with children?
Yeah.
Once they reach the age of having phones.
Sure, yeah. I have 2 kids, 14 and 19. I don't know what I'm doing. So that's my first caveat, you know, like I do all this stuff, but it's a mess. We're all in the trenches together. We're all just trying. I do think that every family is different. Every child is often different. And so trying to stay really tuned into what your family culture and what each kid needs is key. I'm not someone who tends to prescribe like this age you get the cell phone, this age, you know, like I just don't think that makes sense because everyone's different. But I do think there's value to saying like, hey, at night, no devices in the bedroom, right? For all of us, not just you kids, but mom and dad too, like all of us, we're all just gonna charge our phones over there together because this is a family thing and mom and dad are not exempt. We also struggle, right? We're trying to figure this out too. So I think it's an interesting area of parenting life where I think a lot of us actually don't know a whole lot more about how to manage this part of our life than a lot of our kids, right? Like we're struggling too, and I think the journeying together can be really valuable because so much of parenting can become a power struggle, especially as one's children get older. But, you know, the most important thing, and this is a very Jamie Smith, Augustinian way of thinking, is I want to say the best thing you can do for your kids is to help them develop their appetites in a lot of non-screen things. Being outdoors, music, the arts, what is beautiful, cooking, craft, right? Things you do with your hands, skill that you build, right, with your bodies, so that you build in them this appetite. So when the pull of the digital becomes strong, then you could go to this and say, honey, you loved painting, right? Like, you could do this for hours. I know, or you're so good at music or, right, building, right? Let's go do that again, right? Because that's the thing. We need the other resource, right? That reminds us, oh yeah, I did like this. Why don't I do this more, right? And so I think it is cultivating those appetites that will probably be, the most important kind of lodestone that keeps one's children anchored.
Hello. So I'm a computer science major, and it's hard to, my discipline's clearly complicit in a lot of the trends you've been describing. So I guess my question for you is, in addition to how we as users can engage with this technology in a more responsible way, how can people who are engaged in designing and building these technologies do so in a way that's less socially destructive and that kind of thing?
Great question. We need people in computer science and in the digital media and digital industries to be thinking beyond the puzzle, right? Because I think once you're in the job or in the work, you're just given a puzzle. You're just like, make this faster, right? Make this work more smoothly, right? And it's hard to then reach out and be like, okay, what is this actually doing to people, right? And so I think part of doing the work of being on the production end is trying your best to make a few decisions in your own mind about what kind of places you're going to be okay with working at, you know? And this isn't to say that you couldn't work for an Instagram, right? I'm not saying that at all, right? But it's like, I think you need to know in your own mind and heart, like, where can I go and work and be able to sleep at night, right? With myself, knowing I've built this thing. Where's my line? And draw it before you actually get all the way in, because once you're in, it's super hard to draw those lines, right? But I actually think that what's interesting about our digital ecology is that there's nothing intrinsic about the technology that has meant that it has to look the way it does, right? Like, social media doesn't have to be designed the way it is, right? It doesn't have to, you know, I mean, many of these platforms have already started tweaking, like, the likes and that, right? Like, there are different ways to get people onto platforms, right? Different business models even, right? That we've just become unimaginative about. I think there are so many other design ways of building community that I think it would be so interesting to figure out, to puzzle over how do we bring people into spaces online, but then maybe move them back out, right? So it's not just all about, like, we want them in this space so we can monetize them and grab data from them, extraction, right? And so I think, you know, finding different models, building different kinds of ways of actually helping people would be profound, right? And shifting, and I know, you know, that's not where the money is, I understand. But that's where we need, like, this is where the church needs to be in all parts of life, right? We need the church in philanthropy, we need church in finance, we need church in the digital industries, right? So that we need those resources to pour into better technologies, right? That have a different vision of humanity, that doesn't just say, oh, we're just disembodied and we're all just gonna be online, right? If we can walk in with this other vision, you need all the different players in place. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I have a question. So I loved your replacement liturgies that you talked about. And I was just kind of wondering, you mentioned the church, and you mentioned the church being involved in creating spaces for people to meet together. And I was wondering, do you have specific examples? Like, I liked your examples of those liturgies. So, like, do you have or experiments?
Yeah.
So do you have personal ideas for that, or do you have resources for that? Do you know anybody that's written on that?
Yeah. Not a whole lot yet. Those are good questions. I think a very interesting and obvious starting point is to consider having church be a tech-free space on Sunday mornings instead of saying, let's just turn to our Bible apps, right? It's just interesting, right? I think it's just interesting that in the American church that isn't a norm, the tech-free, Sunday worship space. We've just sort of conceded that from the start. Whereas in a lot of other religious institutions, you actually find it to be different, right? Like I was at a bar mitzvah several years ago, and in the synagogue's program, just on the bottom, it just said, this is a holy space. We would, ask that you put away your devices. And, there's no one policing you. You don't have to drop your phone off in a thing. It's like super subtle, super voluntary, but it just says, like, this is what we're doing, folks, right? And it defines the space. And so I think the more we can define that space for each other, that gives us permission, right? I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to tell the story to get around it. But I'm thinking about like summer camps, right? There's you hear story after story about kids that go to summer camp and they're not allowed to have their phones, right? And the first couple days, everyone's like really crabby, right? Like, rah, 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 right? But then by the end of the week, everyone's like having a great time and it's awesome. And they're like saying to each other, wasn't that fantastic? Nobody was on their phones. We didn't have to, right? And so it's that collective thing, right? Like when nobody has it, everyone's like, great, let's go kayaking. Let's do this. Let's play with sticks. Let's build little dams in the stream, like all this goofy stuff, right? That you just wouldn't do if one person just like pulled out their phone on the sly and then everyone's like, oh, yeah, right? And so these summer camp experiences, I think, are just so demonstrative of like how, as institutions and organizations, we need to just own it and create space for people, right? That are the spaces that are tech-free, and that gives people permission, right? And so maybe you do the bold thing. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe some of you already do this or are familiar with like youth groups where it's just like, oh, hey, we're tech-free. Like we're just, there's different ways to do that, right? But it just sets a different expectation of what our time is together. And the key is to not have it be punitive. I mean, once you make it punitive, especially in youth group, game over, right? So it is really believing in the beauty and the delight of embodiment and life together that we need to lean into.
Oh gosh, so much pressure.
So much pressure. Oh my gosh.
I don't know why they had to say that. Dr. Song, thank you so much for the lecture. It was fantastic. And it's funny that you started talking about student ministry because that's kind of my mindset. I work with middle school students at a local church, and technology, when I think about technology and kind of the digital age, especially for current 11 through 13-year-olds, asking them to not have a phone in their minds is not unlike asking them to not have a hand. They don't remember a time where technology was not readily accessible or as ubiquitous as you talked about. And so
Yeah.
one of the things that I feel like me and some of the other people on our team wrestle with back and forth is technology or the digital spaces that we find ourselves in, is that something that we completely try to avoid, or knowing that our students are there in kind of this digital marketplace, if you will, do we go there and try to use technology in a redemptive way? And I find that dichotomy, I think, at play, at least in my own head, a lot, and trying to figure out how to balance that out well. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so like, should you be on TikTok and making cool videos?
Yeah, honestly, it sounds really silly, but like a couple years ago, we were like, do we make a student Twitch page?
Yeah.
Because so many of our students are there, and that is where, that is their like public space that they find themselves in. Do we go there to engage them in that space? You know, we're on Instagram. Do we make a TikTok? We have a YouTube page. Like, how do we utilize those things well? And so I feel like we're just talking about that all the time as a team.
Yeah, no, that's really good question. It is perplexing. I mean, I think you've heard the talk, and so you know that I'm leery of churches necessarily thinking that the technology is just a tool that's value-free, right? That's neutral. I think it. Unfortunately, we're always working in proprietary spaces when we're ministries trying to reach people. I think the principle that makes sense to me as a non-practitioner, so you can help me with this, is the idea of thinking about using online spaces as a first point of contact, but that your goal is always to move people offline, right? Your goal is always to move people into the way of being human, the fullness of ourselves, right? That brings all of ourselves in all the awkwardness and the weaknesses that we might present, but to help people move into that. And so maybe you do build that page on Twitch, but that isn't where you're going to do ministry. Like, it's a way to invite. And then it's thinking, well, what am I doing? What am I inviting them to? And is that thing that I'm inviting them to, right, is that thing going to draw them? What do I need to draw them? So I think I would rather see ministries spend a lot of time working out what are we inviting people to, rather than how can we pour a lot of time into making like the coolest whatever online, right? And I would say that about church in general, right? Like Sunday morning church, right? If people aren't coming to church anymore because they're just watching the streaming, right, service, it's like, well, then what are we inviting people to, right? Like, if they don't have to come to church to get the thing at church, then like, if we say church is actually the people, like, well, is it the people or what, right? And so we need to get really real about that and say, well, how do we make Sunday church, that part of church, something that is going to get people out of bed and say, no, I want to be there. I want to see that person, or I want to be with those people, because it makes a difference, right? Because it's a bummer when I'm at home. Like, sometimes I need that because I'm sick or I'm traveling, right? But that's a bummer. I want to always be there.
Please put your hands together for Dr. Song here.
Thank you.
I saw one or two hands left up, and so she'll be here for a few minutes afterwards, just if you want to grab her and maybe have a question personally. I literally felt like tonight as she was talking, I thought, I feel like this is like an AA meeting, where, one person who, has struggled with addiction in her own life is talking to the rest of us who are currently at different stages of struggling with our addiction. So it was just, and that's probably not too far off of an application here. So couple of quick last notes. Books. We do have books over there at the table. We do have Dr. Song's book over there, which I would highly recommend you pick up. She's not plugging this, but I'm plugging it for her because it is a great resource for continuing to think and to read through this on these important matters. Next lecture is, what is the date of the next lecture? I meant to look that up. April 9th, there you go. It is on there, April 9th. It's our last one of the year with Ben Myers, so come listen to his Australian accent, and should be a good night. And then, again, thank you all so much for just being here. Your patronage, your support of Lewis House enables us to be able to do the things and do the outreach that we have here on campus. So I'm just honored to have you all here tonight. Thank you all so much, and we'll hope to see you at the next lecture. Take care.